Good morning, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. Total honesty, we are going to do our part to keep up with everything as it's coming out, because even as we're speaking right now, there are draft declarations taking place. There are transfer additions for Georgia. We are bracing for transfer departures from UGA. There's rumors out there that Georgia might not quite be done when it comes to bringing in somewhat big names. So it's like good news and not quite so good news and just, high volume of news. And we're going to do our part, try our best to keep up with it all. The good news is we've got Connor Riley here today to help us do all that as well. So let me kind of lay this the groundwork here. Obviously, the big one right now is Damon Wilson, his announced intent to transfer yesterday. We'll talk about what that means for Georgia. I think there's some big questions out there about that. Georgia's also added a player in the moment since we've been preparing to come on the air today. That's pretty big. Georgia got some good news yesterday about a player ready to run it back for 2025. We're going to have some more fun with that. And we're just going to do everything we can to keep up with it all. We are glad you are with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by ServPro. Cleaning, restoration, construction.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So much to do here today. Before we're done, rumors of perhaps Georgia not quite being done when it comes to transfer wide receivers. We'll have some fun with that. Georgia's also added a player here recently. We're going to get to that. There are draft declarations taking place literally as we're coming on the air. We're going to cover all of that. We'll have some fun with an announcement from yesterday, a Georgia player announcing his intention to run it back for 2025. So we knew it would be like this. We're not surprised. We're not caught off guard, but we are also doing everything we can just to sort of hold on and provide some sort of commentary and analysis for the news as it's coming out. We'll do our part on all of that here today. Connor Riley will help us coming up in a couple of minutes. But let's begin right here. Yesterday, it's the kind of thing you sort of brace for. You've kind of come to expect it as a possibility. That one transfer name that you're like, oh, that's not really one that I was hoping to hear. You know that every team is going to lose double-digit transfers off its roster every single season. That is just unavoidable. Kirby Smart himself has said that their goal in all of this is kind of really only to keep about 70% of the players they sign out of high school. So they are resigned, right from the word go, that they're essentially going to lose about a third of the guys they sign off of every one of their high school classes. That's just the nature of the beast in the transfer portal world and the transfers that are kind of enticed by the NIL and all the stuff that's out there. You just know you're going to lose people. Some of those you kind of expect, and some of those you're, if we're being honest, sometimes kind of okay with because maybe it creates some space for somebody else to get more playing time, and that's a conversation that fans often have. However, as I said, there are also the transfers that you're like, boy, that's not one I necessarily wanted to hear. And I believe that yesterday we had an example of that when edge rusher Damon Wilson announced his plans to transfer. Now, total honesty here, I would obviously hope that Georgia could still make some sort of overture to Wilson and maybe convince him to stay. Obviously, you would assume that money might be a part of that just in the world we live right now. I think you're probably educated guess would lead you to believe that Georgia's probably already paid Wilson a pretty penny already, just given the nature of recruit that he was and the nature of that recruiting battle that Georgia was involved with. It allowed Wilson to come to Georgia when it did, but perhaps even more money to get him to stay if there's a chance of that happening. I would certainly hope that's the case. I would certainly hope that you're able to do that, because I do believe that Wilson, had he returned for 2025, would have had a chance to be the real face, one of the faces anyway, of this Georgia defense. And despite the fact that Wilson only had, 3 sacks this year, had a half a sack in his freshman season, the kind of breakout performance that we all kind of believe he has the potential for, I think there was some real reason to think that could happen for him in 2025. But obviously, here's what we know. We kind of know that these other programs are just going to be in his ear. And they're going to be saying things like, boy, do you really want to be at Georgia? You could get better stats somewhere else, and you could do this, you could do that. We know these programs are going to be negatively recruiting against a guy like Wilson and probably anybody else on the Georgia roster too. And Georgia, we know, behind the scenes is always fighting like mad to sell kind of the best version of itself. And if this is truly what has happened with Wilson, someone's gotten his ear and said, hey, you don't want to go back to Georgia because whatever else. The real shame of that is that when go back to the beginning of the year when Damon was kind of ready for maybe more playing time and kind of a year into the system and a little bit more experience and kind of ready for a little bit more, at that time, Damon was seemingly really saying all the right things about why he chose Georgia the first time and kind of what he was hoping for from Georgia here this year. I want to go back in time to, I guess this is like right before the season began. Damon was saying all the right stuff. So the fact that now, after another year where he's gotten some experience and maybe setting the stage for even more success in a junior season where to take place here in Athens, it's a shame to think this guy might be leaving because it wasn't all that long ago that he was saying all the stuff I think you'd want a Georgia player like Damon to be saying. This is him just before the season began.
I would say my whole football career, I've pretty much always won. We've always been a competitive football team. I don't like to lose. I don't like to be in a situation where I have to worry about losing. Like, Georgia's one of those places where I knew I was going to be pushed. I wasn't just going to be the best guy. I don't want to just be the best guy. Sometimes you got to be around people who are better than you and make you better. And I think being around someone like Coach Smart, like he kind of like my dad, just put your head down, work, don't worry about where you are in the beginning. At the end, if you just keep grinding and trust the process, you're going to be where you want to be.
I mean, I love that. That's what you want to got to say, right? Hey, I'm going to keep grinding. I'm going to trust the process. Well, now you would think that's getting ready to possibly pay off for Damon Wilson. And perhaps, though, he's suddenly kind of changing his mind. And perhaps, listen, throughout all of this, I really don't fault the player necessarily, whether it be Damon or somebody else, because you kind of know the soundtrack that's probably in their head of, boy, if you come here, you can make, however much money, you can get so many more stats, you can do this, you can do that, you can kind of dominate the stat sheet. That's not going to happen at Georgia. That's not going to be the case at Georgia. We just sort of know the volume of commentary these players must be listening to from people who are close to them, for people who are trying to get close to the people who are close to the players. There is just an endless loop of negative recruiting. And Georgia's not the only school that's impacted by it. I would say that oftentimes Georgia's impacted by it almost the most because Georgia probably has the largest number of players on the roster who other programs are trying to pry away. And, that's just what it comes down to, that even for a guy like Damon, who seems to have come to Georgia for the right reasons and seemed to have approached his first 2 years here at Georgia with kind of the right thought process of the, as Kirby Smart has said, work while you wait mentality. All of a sudden now, even though he's maybe at the doorstep of really having a chance to have some real accomplishments at Georgia, all of a sudden now, the grass may just seem greener somewhere else. And I'll tell you what this reminds me of a little bit. We talked yesterday about that really long press conference that Kirby Smart was forced to endure. You'll talk about an unhappy guy. Go watch this on the DawgNation YouTube page. Smart sitting there for like 45 minutes asking, in some cases, fairly inane questions, and in some cases, maybe in more insightful ones. But it's just a long press conference of dealing with all kinds of crazy stuff. And one of the things that did come up in that press conference was, the idea of there no longer being much loyalty in college football anymore. That this notion that, hey, players going to stick by your program and they're going to be with you through thick and thin. There's just less of that than there used to be. And, I thought that Kirby, and I think he's really good at this. Kirby is pretty good as a golfer of just sort of playing the ball where it lies, not, gnashing teeth about the good old days back when, a man's word was his bond or whatever else. Kirby doesn't spend a whole lot of time kind of lamenting about all of that. Kirby seems to be pretty wide-eyed and kind of open-eyed about the current landscape of the sport. And Smart told us just a few days ago that when it comes to a player perhaps leaving because he's got a bigger offer or what he maybe views as a better opportunity, the idea that loyalty is going to prevent somebody from doing that, Smart says not anymore, not in this version of the sport. This is him from a couple of days ago.
As far as the portal and loyalty, look, we're in a different day and time. Kids are leaving high schools left and right. There's not a long-term loyalty to programs like there was. I would be remiss if I tried to live in this fantasy world that kids were just going to be loyal to their school. You know, like, let's be honest, the schools make a lot of money off of football programs. That money is then reinvested into all kinds of other athletic programs, and in some cases in the university. So the football program is the face of most universities, not all, most universities. So the ability to be successful at that is helpful to all the sports teams. So these young men in this room play football because they love it, they care about it. We sell and educate them on this university and how special it is and how great the opportunity they have to play at it. Not everybody's going to be convicted on that and put that before their own individual lifestyles and choices. I've accepted that. That doesn't keep me from still selling it. Doesn't keep me from still pushing it. Doesn't keep me from having a culture of buy-in that we're better together, and the better we do together, the more all of us get in accolades. And that's what we want to push. But I can't answer for the rest of college football or what everybody else does.
I tell you, when I listen to that and when I think about the Damon Wilson news, and I'm not trashing Damon. I mean, ultimately, guys got to do what they think is best for them. But what it brings to mind for me is that era in 2021 and 2022, it was really, really special. And you had guys back then that were okay with not getting as many personal accolades, not getting as many stats. And the 2021 season sort of playing in the pre-NIL era. 2022, you know, Georgia wasn't impacted by transfers, at least to a great degree, you know, that year. This was sort of old-fashioned college football. And many Georgia fans have sort of said these may be the last, and this is obviously a, you know, kind of a Georgia-centric opinion, but nonetheless, these were the last true national championships, and whatever happens after that is kind of a sort of a new version of the sport. And to a degree, I understand where people are coming from when they say that. And if you're a Georgia fan watching and listening right now, I hope you enjoyed that as much as all of us did, because the kind of loyalty that Smart says no longer exists, that team had it. The kind of devotion to the team concept, to not getting tons of stats and just sort of being a part of you know, a team concept and assuming you'd be rewarded by the NFL later on for committing yourself to the team right now, that really worked to the tune of back-to-back national championships, and now it's probably over. It just probably is. And that whatever Georgia's recipe for success is moving forward is probably just going to be different than that. And I'll be honest with you. As it relates to a guy like Damon Wilson, who I really would want Georgia to be able to keep, whether it's more money or more opportunity or more of whatever he wants, within reason, if I was in charge of Georgia football, I would do anything I could to keep Damon Wilson. But when it goes beyond perhaps the NIL and goes to maybe, like, as you would maybe assume, sort of the stat sheet stuff and the fact that, you know, at Georgia, the dominant edge rusher just doesn't put up the same kind of stats that they do in other programs. Even a guy like Nolan Smith, ironically, who became a first-round pick as kind of the outside linebacker at UGA, the year in which that happened in 2022, he spent a lot of that year injured. So even Nolan, as a first-round pick edge rusher from Georgia, didn't have, like, massive stats while at UGA. The number one overall pick in the previous year, Trayvon Walker, playing a, you know, hand-in-the-dirt defensive end position, he also didn't have the big stats. That the best defensive players at Georgia often don't have big stats. And what we're learning maybe through some of this is that even with the promise of a major payday in the NFL, perhaps some players still want their stats. Perhaps that's the case. And you might guess that's what's going on with Damon Wilson. If you did guess that way, you might be right about that. And as I said, I don't fully know necessarily what you do about all of that, because the truth is, I think a lot of us would have kind of Monday morning quarterback at the beginning of the season, which is, hey, you got to have a guy like Damon Wilson on the field more, and you got to take somebody else off the field if you have to make that happen. For instance, a guy that sometimes would be kind of in the crosshairs for some fans, let's just have a candid conversation here for a moment. A guy that would sometimes be in the crosshairs for some fans would be a guy like Chaz Chambliss, because Chambliss was not as highly rated a recruit as Damon Wilson is, or if you want to kind of compare that to Mikael Williams, not as highly rated as Mikael Williams was. And so for a lot of Georgia fans, their assumption is, and it's not necessarily a wrong assumption, but their assumption is, hey, let's get the sort of high upside athletes on the field, a guy like Wilson. If that means putting a guy like Chaz Chambliss on the bench, hey, this is not show friends, it's show business. You got to make some tough choices sometimes. And that's what people would have assumed. But this year, and I don't know how many people are really aware of this, This is one of those numbers that I think sort of hides in plain sight a little bit. This year, Chaz Chambliss had 6.5 sacks. Chaz Chambliss had a really good season. So you would like for Damon Wilson to have gotten some more stats, to be maybe feeling a little bit more a part of the team, and obviously maybe a little bit more of a taste for him of what 2025 could be. But at the expense of Chaz Chambliss, who this year played really well for you, I mean, that's just the tough thing about Georgia is you want the starring role, you want to be the face of the defense, but man, it is even now with Georgia probably not quite being defensively what it was in its championship seasons of a couple of years ago, the competition to be the face of this Georgia defense or the face of any Georgia position group, it remains really, really tough. And I say that as a guy that would like for Damon Wilson to stay, but part of the reason that Wilson wasn't a bigger part of the stat sheet this year, I think Damon also kind of has to own some of that for himself because other guys were producing in a way that, just based on what we're seeing, it sort of seems like he wasn't. And I guess my sort of final point on this is whether it's Damon Wilson deciding to come back for 2025 or somebody else from the ranks of waiting the wings or somebody else in some future year that maybe we don't even know about yet, I would like to see Georgia cultivate the dominant edge rusher. It's always been kind of one of my wishes for the defense that, we've seen the truly great defensive linemen. Jordan Davis won the Bednarik Award or the Nagurski, which he won one of those Defensive Player of the Year awards, won the Lombardi Trophy. We've seen multiple Butkus Award winners at Georgia, nation's best linebacker. We've seen, Thorpe Award winners. We've seen All-Americans, throughout the defense. But in terms of like the true dominant edge rusher, we really haven't seen that at Georgia yet. Jalen Walker kind of got some of that this year because he was rushing the passer, but he also was a hybrid guy that also played some on the inside too. That, I would like to see Georgia shift and create a little bit more of a starring role for this position because it is the kind of premium position that NFL draft type situation. Teams love to draft in the first round, and I think it can just make things easier for your defense to have the dominant guy coming off the edge. And it seems like for all that Georgia's done defensively, they've sort of done everything but this in the past. So, all of this, I think, leaves Georgia with a lot of really big questions here right now. Can you convince Wilson to stay? Can you maximize his potential if he does? Can you make the edge rush position a more dominant part of your defense in the future? Because I really do believe, as I mentioned a moment ago, the great story of 2021 and 2022, players that did show true loyalty to UGA and didn't seem to mind if they weren't getting great stats and didn't seem to mind if they weren't getting as much attention as they would have maybe gotten playing somewhere else. It seems like that era is done, both for Georgia and college football as a whole. And finding a way to make stars out of some of the elite talent you have, maybe that's just the cost of doing business now. And we'll see how Georgia reacts to that market if the market really is shifting in that direction. Now, speaking of shifting, let me shift to something completely different here for a moment because we're trying to cover everything that's going on here right now. I do have some good news to tell you. Georgia has won with a transfer portal target here, and it's a guy that's got a pretty good bit of experience. Jaden Harris has played a lot for Miami, has started games with the Hurricanes, frankly started a good number of games with the Hurricanes. And we learned this morning, you read the story at DawgNation.com, that Jaden Harris, a safety, is now on his way to the University of Georgia. Obviously playing kind of a high-level program at Miami. That's good news. But the other thing about Harris here is he played his high school football in Georgia. It was at Riverwood High School. Many of you know this. Our good friend Terrence Edwards' brother Robert, the legendary former Georgia running back, also a terrific Georgia high school football coach. He's now at his alma mater of Washington County. But before going to Waco, he was at Riverwood. So Jaden Harris's high school football coach is Robert Edwards. So there's a nice little tie here as it relates to Georgia for Harris, and we know this is a position of need. We did get the declaration yesterday, Malachi Starks going to the NFL draft, as you expect that he would. Dan Jackson is moving on. Obviously, Jake Pope has moved on to the extent that was a factor in all of this. So we have kind of known that safety was going to be a really crucial position for Georgia. We believe that Zion Branch can be one of the solutions there on that. And now we find out that Jaden Harris, who's got a lot more playing experience than Zion does, is now another one of these. So this is that kind of time, kind of post-season, when your season comes to a close, you've got just a fire hose of information coming out. Some of that news is good, some of that news quite not so good. But in the case of Jaden Harris, this is a guy that I believe that you could be really happy to have on this roster as he competes for playing time and contributes to depth and tries to find a home here at UGA, leaning on the previous experience that he's gotten to aid him in that cause. So we're glad to have Jaden Harris here at UGA and also excited about seeing what happens next for these Dogs. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Presented today by ServPro. We're glad you're here. Boy, so much to try to cover, so much to keep up with. Some of it a little bit of a mess, but you know what? We're doing our part to kind of figure it all out. And speaking of a mess, if you've got a mess to clean up around your property, maybe it's the home you live in or maybe it's a warehouse commercial property that you own or manage or something like that. If you've got a big mess to clean up, fire has broken out, water damage, you think about, leaky roof, something like that creates a huge, huge mess. When you have something like that, you want it cleaned up and put back together like it never even happened. That's what our friends at ServPro are all about. They are, after all, restoration specialists. They specialize in restoring your property to its previous condition. And if somebody walks in and sees it, they'll never even know that anything like the damage you were dealing with was ever there. There will be literally no evidence of it anywhere. It'll be like it never even happened. That's what ServPro is all about. Find them online, servpro.com. It's SERV, servpro.com. Let the restoration specialists come out and do great work for you. They've done that for us here at DawgNation. They can do that for you here too. So a lot to cover here when it comes to all of what ServPro can do for you. So make sure you check them out online, servpro.com. Get your mess cleaned up, get it put back together. They'll take care of all that for you. Plus, every ServPro franchise, independently owned and operated. That means when you do business with ServPro, you're doing business with someone who's got just as much of a vested interest in a positive outcome for you as you do for yourself. One more time, it's servpro.com, S-E-R-V, servpro.com. All right, we got Connor Riley here coming up. And as I said, we're just going to try to do our part to kind of keep up with all the sort of draft declarations and transfer departures and transfer arrivals. It's kind of like being an air traffic controller right now with folks taking off and landing and everything else. So we'll let Connor Riley help us with that here coming up in just a moment. Prior to that, though, let's go around the doghouse. And got some good news yesterday with one of the guys who perhaps had a draft decision he could have made, or some other decision too if he wanted to, I reckon. Christian Miller, though, letting it be known that he wants to run it back for these Dogs here in 2025. We think that Miller, the best that I can tell as a non-scout, we think that Miller had a really good year for Georgia. Played a lot, became a very important, player for UGA. Also kind of battled injury, got back on the field. But when Miller was on the field, I just think he's a really good defensive lineman. And if you want to succeed in the SEC, this sort of experience up front for a defense, I just think it's almost like a bedrock necessity. You really have to have it in order to be able to succeed. And so Miller coming back, we think for Georgia, just really good news. We also think that he kind of brings kind of a cool personality back to UGA. We think he has a chance to be a terrific vocal leader for these Dogs. Really one of the most fun things we did while in New Orleans. Remember Media Day just about a week or so ago leading into that Sugar Bowl? We had a chance to talk to so many Georgia players that day. I don't know that any of those players, though, was more entertaining than Christian Miller was. And I think when you kind of see the way in which Miller was sort of, having fun in front of the camera and, kind of making entertaining for Dog fans, a guy like this coming back for this season, I think you get even more excited about that. Let me give you a couple of seconds worth here of me and Christian Miller having some fun. Christian's a great guy and a great announcement that he's returning for 2025. This is good stuff from Christian Miller last week. How you feeling right now?
I feel blessed.
Are you
feeling?
Listen, I'm feeling great, but people don't care about how I feel. They care about how you feel.
Man, it's not all about me. It's about you too, man.
I love that. Are you going to be able to play this week?
Is it cold outside? Yeah, I'm going to play.
I love to hear that from Christian Miller. Obviously, you're a big leader. You've had a lot of fun here. How much have you enjoyed what you've been able to see from your defense? Big performance against Texas in the SEC Championship. You got this team right where they want to be. How much fun is it to watch this unit kind of grow around you?
First of all, I love your energy. Second of all, man, I love my group, man. It's a lot of guys with heart. It's a lot of guys that put a lot of effort towards practice, towards the game, and they got a lot of pride. So I love that. So I love my group. I feel like we're really tough, and I just like playing with them boys, man.
I just love that from Christian Miller, man. Not just because he gives me a compliment. I'm sure he probably thought, who is this guy screaming in my face right now? I'm sure he probably was a little caught off guard by some of that, but That's the kind of leadership you'd like to see back at Georgia here next year. And so all I would say to you with all of this is, while you are, keeping up with who's leaving and who's going, and a lot of that kind of centers around the transfer stuff here right now, pay close attention to anytime somebody like this that's got good experience and has done some good things for you. When a guy like that makes his decision to return, make sure you pay attention to that, because whether it be, obviously the golden example of this is, what Nick Chubb and Sonny Michel and our guy Davin Bellamy and Lorenzo Carter did before the 2017 season, or what Devontae Wyatt and Jordan Davis would have done before the 2021 season. I'm not trying to put that level of, importance or pressure on Miller's return. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I am trying to say, though, that sometimes those decisions for veteran players who could leave, when they choose to stay, it has a tendency to work out good for Georgia. Maybe Miller could be the example of that. Maybe over the course of the next couple of days, we'll see a few more folks decide to join Christian Miller in making that decision. So that's around the doghouse. Say, before I bring on Connor Riley and talk to him more about everything that's going on, can I also give a shout out to our friends at Academy Sports and Outdoors here too? Because if you're like me, we're kind of on the other side of Christmas. You had some holiday travel. You had some things like that. Well, guess what? Now we're kind of back in the new year. We're kind of back ready to go and kind of, you got kids getting back in sports. Everybody's got a lot of stuff going on. So all the gear you need to kind of get this new year started with all the sports stuff you have happening here in 2025, you can get that at prices that you'll love right there at Academy Sports and Outdoors. You can do curbside pickup. That makes it really convenient. But it's also never been easier to kind of shop for all the brands and the apparel and the equipment that that Academy Sports and Outdoors has for you. You can do it in-store or online at academy.com. So check them out today online, academy.com. We love Academy Sports and Outdoors. We are so happy to have them as a part of DawgNation Daily here today. We're also happy to have Connor Riley here too. A lot to cover. Who's staying? Who's going? Can they convince Damon Wilson to change his mind? We'll see. Let's do all of that right now. Connor Riley here today, DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
There is important news to get to with Connor Riley. Let me start, though, with what I believe is the latest breaking piece of news, and we'll sort of work backwards from there. Just as we're getting ready to go on the air today, Jared Wilson, I believe, has announced his plans to attend the Senior Bowl. That is a signal that he will not be returning to Georgia here next year, which obviously creates, after what Dylan Fairchild has announced, and Tate Ratledge now moving on to the NFL, his eligibility coming to an end. That creates a lot of open space for this Georgia offensive line here in 2025, does it not?
It does, but I think especially in regard to Jared Wilson, I actually think Georgia's going to be fine at center. They've got Drew Bobo there. I was impressed with what I saw from him in those starts against Auburn and Mississippi State. So while, yes, losing a guy like Jared Wilson, may not be easy for some fans, this is a guy that was really impressed by NFL draft scouts. This is something that I think had been coming for a while if you follow sort of the NFL draft chatter year round. An incredible athlete. Yes, he only has 12 career starts to his name, but this is a 4-year player. I believe he's already graduated from the University of Georgia. And let's be honest here, they had a collection of really talented players in the offensive line. Tate Ratledge and Dylan Fairchild were All-Americans this year. And yet the offensive line still underperformed. And so, yes, you always want to bring back talented players, and I'm sure plenty would have liked to have seen what Jared Wilson and what Dylan Fairchild could do going forward with it. So Georgia program that invests a lot in its offensive line, they've continued to do that. And so you have to, I think, trust that they've got quality players behind them. I know at center they do in Drew Bobo there. We'll wait and see what Micah Morris ultimately elects to do. Maybe you can move Ernest Green down into the guard spot. I know they really like Daniel Calhoun and the upside that he brings there. And so, this is a similar spot. A year ago, Georgia thought they were going to lose, or Georgia knew they were probably losing Cedric Van Pran Granger. He goes on to the NFL. Now Jared Wilson's the next off the assembly line. And this is just sort of the reality of what you do when you recruit and develop on the offensive line like Georgia does.
I guess the scouting report on Wilson is he's very, very athletic, runs fast, for instance. So my guess is he's going to test really well, and NFL draft scouts always like that. That said, I guess I'm still a little bit surprised by this. Now, admittedly, I hadn't spent 5 seconds thinking about it before Wilson made his announcement, but knee-jerk reaction, I'm a little bit surprised by this. It sounds like you're not, though.
Why are you surprised by it?
I mean, like I said, I hadn't spent a ton of time thinking about it, but I guess my just first assumption is he was just probably going to come back.
I think part of it to keep in mind here, he's been in the program for 4 years. He's earned his degree from the University of Georgia. And some of these guys are ready to move on. And so he's likely gotten an indication from the NFL Draft Advisory Board that he has a draftable grade. And so he's got an opportunity, I think, waiting for him at the next level. And this is a guy, again, let's remember, has won 2 SEC championships here at the time at University of Georgia. He's won 2 national championships in the time here at the University of Georgia. Yes, sure, maybe you'd like to see him have more starts, but the reality is this is a player who's already accomplished a lot in his time here at the University of Georgia. And it's important to remember that some guys, are just ready to be done with school and move on to that next portion of life. Yes, for every Bo Nix or Jaden Daniels that sticks in college until they're 23, 24 years old, this is the traditional path that you see these guys take. Jared Wilson was a 4-year player in college, and now he moves on to the NFL.
Let me ask you one more thing about the offensive line, because there's plenty more we got to talk about. When we kind of move into the next phase of this football conversation of 2025, the most important players during spring practice and stuff like that, you mentioned a name that I believe is going to be near the very top of that list. With Fairchild leaving, with, even though it's a different position, with Wilson leaving, a guy like Daniel Calhoun, who I like a lot. I think I just based on what I saw from him in high school, I think he has a chance to have a very, very bright future in college. I really do. Big, giant, strong offensive lineman. That's a real, I think, valuable prospect. But what an important next few months it's going to be for a guy like Daniel Calhoun, because this Georgia offensive line really does need to reinvent itself a little bit. And I think that Calhoun could be a part of that process. But, boy, that's one of those names that Georgia fans, I believe, got to be really acquainting themselves with as you move towards spring practice, which will obviously be here before you know it.
Yeah, and look, I'll be the first to say it. There was not a bigger Daniel Calhoun fan at DawgNation than me. I played with both of his older brothers in my time at high school, and this is a guy that impressed early on, made the Georgia travel squad this year, which is not nothing for a freshman like him to do. And look, they're going to have options at guard. I'm still waiting to see what Micah Morris ultimately does. Could they move Ernest Green down inside to guard, and maybe you play Jamal Merriweather or Bo Hewley at tackle next season? That is an option as well. But I know they expect big things from Daniel Calhoun, and he's a guy that has the talent, that has the tools. He just sort of needs to get the seasoning there. And that's why I think, as you point out, BA, this spring is going to be massively important for Calhoun if he's to step in and become a quick starter on this offensive line.
Well, let's talk about Damon Wilson here for a moment. Obviously, we spent a lot of time off the top discussing that. Are you assuming that Georgia's trying to do what it can to keep him? And B, do you think there's any chance that happens?
I think that they are doing everything they can to keep him. I do not expect him to come back to Georgia next season. I can understand Damon Wilson in theory trying to get more money from the University of Georgia. That's just the day and age that we live in. The game is the game in that regard. But there's such a clear opportunity for Damon Wilson to step into a larger role next season, and the Georgia coaches have no doubt explain that to them. As someone who was on this team this year, he knows that. Jalen Walker, gone to the NFL. Michael Williams, gone to the NFL. Chaz Chambliss, gone to the NFL. He knew that all those guys were leaving, and yet he still makes the decision to enter the transfer portal there in that regard. Look, some guys just want to change of scenery, and I'd point out at this outside linebacker position, we've seen this kind of behavior before. Brenton Cox leaves to go to elsewhere, ends up at Florida. Jermaine Johnson transfers to Florida State. Even a year ago, Marvin Jones Jr. transfers to Florida State. And so this is a position where Georgia has seen this kind of move before. They've recruited very well at the outside linebacker position in this recruiting cycle. But I don't think that those guys, Isaiah Gibson, Darren Akinobon, Chase Linton, can go in and give what Damon Wilson could have potentially given you in this coming season there. So it is a loss, but at the same point in time, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't necessarily make him drink it. And I think that's sort of the case here with Damon Wilson, a guy who maybe just wants to change the scenery and a chance to do things differently than the way that Georgia uses their outside linebackers here.
I just think the 2x4 of truth to our face on this is that Georgia's selling players on, hey, come here. You may not get great stats, but the NFL is going to love you. You'll go on to be a first-round pick. You can be a part of championship teams. I think the unfortunate part of this is, and this is all me reading into the situation, but my somewhat educated guess on this is that no matter what you may be able to say about, well, look at Nolan Smith. He was here, didn't have big stats. He became a first-round pick even in a year when he was injured. Or, Trayvon Walker, who was a little bit different position, but nonetheless first overall pick without getting big stats. Even if that's true, and it obviously is, it certainly seems like players still want their stats. And I just think for Georgia, the era of 2021 and 2022, as great as it was, I think that's over. And that level of loyalty, and if you want to call it unselfishness or however you want to describe it, I'm not trashing Wilson. I'm just saying there was something really special about those 2 years for Georgia. Whatever college football is now, it's just not that anymore. And I do think you got to play by the current rules if you want to be successful now.
You got to try and find a way and win with, I think, 53 players rather than 85.
Yeah.
College football, with the transient nature, with the way these rosters turn over, is turning more and more into an NFL game. And so the day and age of building guys like Damon Wilson, like they had planned to do with him, and building him up over the course of an entire college career, those days are just gone. And you're going to need to win with guys that are able to play right away and make an immediate impact in that regard. And so that's something that I think Georgia is having to adjust to on the fly. They had built out the infrastructure, I think, to have more teams like that 21 team, like that 22 team. And then the game just changes like that. And I think Georgia has done as good a job as they can, maybe adjusting that, but they've still clearly got adjustments to make going forward. And I don't know how closely you follow this. I hope that I get a chance to get into this later this week. This 2023 recruiting class that Georgia signed, and Damon Wilson was the #1 player that Georgia signed in that recruiting class, is kind of turning into an unmitigated disaster. Assuming that Damon Wilson ends up leaving, 12 of the 26 players that they signed in that class will no longer be on the roster going into their third year. And that doesn't even necessarily include guys who are further potentially expected to go into the transfer portal. And so you talk so often about that junior class and what those guys mean to this program. You think that 2022 team, that 2020 class that they signed was pretty special in that regard. And you had guys like a Keely Ringo, a Jalen Carter, a John O. Washington making huge impacts. There aren't a lot of faces on that 2025 team that are still here, a part of that 2023 recruiting class. And as the season unfolds, and this Georgia team, as we certainly sit here today, maybe looks a little step backwards from where it has been in years past, that 2023 recruiting class where Damon Wilson was the big signing day win for them, I think is a big reason why.
That's certainly a very interesting point, and certainly something to keep our eyes on here. Kind of look forward to more coverage from you on that. Let me also kind of talk about this as it relates to the Wilson thing here for a moment. I said this earlier. We've sort of seen Georgia do everything but produce the dominant edge rusher. Now, when I said that earlier, I probably didn't give enough credit to Azeez Ojulari the year he had in 2020. He had a great year for Georgia. Wasn't a first-round pick, but he had a great year for Georgia in 2020. So let me make sure I at least mention Azeez in this conversation. But we've seen I forget which one Jordan won, if it's the Bednarik or the Nagurski, but he won like a Defensive Player of the Year award. We've seen multiple Butkus Award winners. We've seen Thorpe Award winners. We've seen All-Americans all over the place. We've seen first-round picks sort of everywhere. But even for Georgia's first-round pick at outside linebacker, Nolan Smith, he spent most of the 2022 season, or at least a lot of that season, injured, was not playing for Georgia at the end of the year. I really do, as a fan, wish that this is the achievement that Georgia could unlock, that it could have an edge rusher, have the dominant season to kind of go with what Georgia has been able to do with the other position groups. At a certain point in time, I do think Georgia kind of needs to look more like what I think the rest of the sport looks like, where oftentimes your very best player is going to be your pass rusher. And we haven't really seen the Georgia defense do that for as good as it's been. But moving forward, I think you might need to see Georgia kind of unlock the potential of that edge rusher, whether it's Wilson deciding to stay or somebody else in some future year. To me, that's the sort of final frontier, I believe, for this Georgia defense.
I would disagree that they need to change the way that they play defense in that regard. You look at the way that this program has always operated under Kirby Smart. He wants the strength of the defense not to be out on the edges with the corners and the edge rushers, but through the spine, defensive tackles, inside linebacker, and safeties. And that's why Georgia has traditionally always produced really good players at those positions. And look, yes, you hate to lose a guy like Damon Wilson, but they're going to continue to prioritize that. You know, they signed Zayden Walker. They signed Elijah Griffin in this past class. I know that you want to try and have as much talent as you can, but Georgia has made it pretty clear how they want to continue to build their defense. And for the most part, I don't take issue with that. Yes, you want to have those big sack numbers and continue to dominate in that regard. But especially with what we've seen from Glenn Schumann as the defensive coordinator and the imprint that he has put on this defense, I don't think that Georgia values that outside linebacker edge rusher, defensive end type in the way that maybe some people might want them to see. But I can't sit here and say that it's been a real problem for Georgia either because of what they traditionally get out of defensive tackle, out of inside linebacker, and out of safety.
I would just follow up by that by saying that was certainly true in 2021, 2022, but you look at the last couple of years, they've also had some issues on the edge, not just with oftentimes not getting enough sacks, but sometimes sort of setting the edge for outside runs. I would sort of attribute some of that to some of the quarterback run issues too. So I don't want to say it like this, but I can't think of another way to say it, the lack of priority on the edge position, I mean, I think you're at times seeing that be problematic for Georgia defensively the last couple of years.
Well, but then you're asking two separate things there. Setting the edge and being a dominant run defender is very different than getting high-quality sack production out of your outside linebackers. I thought Michael Williams was a very good run defender for Georgia in that regard, but he only had 5 sacks, and I think there are people out there that would like to see that number be greater there. And so, yes, the inability to defend a quarterback runs in this season certainly helped Georgia. I'm not going to try and sugarcoat that. I wonder if that is maybe more a structural issue with the way that Georgia elects to play defense rather than an indictment of the edge rusher position, because Chaz Chambliss had 6.5 sacks this season. Jalen Walker, who played both inside linebacker and outside linebacker, had 6.5 sacks this season as well. The only 2 players under Kirby Smart that have had more sacks in a season were DeAndre Walker in 2018 and Azeez Ojulari in 2020. So the production from that edge rusher spot was there in some regards this season. And it, as you saw, I don't think made necessarily the difference on this Georgia defense that people were looking for.
Yeah, I want to just one more, and then we'll talk about something else to finish our time. But as you mentioned, I talked about the Chaz Chambliss part of this a little earlier too, because at the beginning of the year, it was very easy for the sort of, Monday morning quarterbacking fans, and we're kind of right there in the middle of all that too. We're always, kind of sort of imagining how things should be. It would have been very easy for a lot of those fans, maybe myself included, to say, hey, you got to find a bigger role for a guy like Wilson. You got to make sure he's on the field. You got to give him his chance to produce. And for a lot of people, it would have been, you got to take Chaz Chambliss off the field so guys like Mikael Williams and Damon Wilson can produce more because they were thought to have more athletic upside. But I think very quietly, and as I mentioned a moment ago, I don't think people realize what kind of year Chaz Chambliss really had for Georgia. So the dilemma of, well, how do you keep a guy like Damon Wilson happy? The truth is, when he was, either not playing or seeing some of his productivity go elsewhere, Chaz Chambliss was having a really good year. It was not as simple as saying, well, put Chambliss on the bench so Wilson can do more, because if you had put Chaz Chambliss on the bench, you probably would have gotten worse as a team, because he, at least in my eyes, seemed to have a very good season.
At no point this season was Damon Wilson a better football player than Chaz Chambliss was for this team. And I know that might be hard for some people to accept. And yes, that's all part of the delicate roster balance that you got to have and put out there. But at the same point in time, and I'll be interested in seeing going forward what sort of the road for criticism of players and the willingness that we're able to discuss them, because I think on this show, you've pointed out time and time again, we don't traditionally go after players. We aren't necessarily hard on players because traditionally these guys are 18, 19, 20 years old, figuring things out for the first time at a high level. But when these players are making these types of decisions and commanding the dollar amounts that these guys are demanding, this idea that these guys are kids anymore isn't exactly something that I hold necessarily true. They're making a lot of money. Kids shouldn't necessarily make that kind of money. So I believe that you are in some ways an adult. And in some ways, because if you're willing to accept that paycheck, you accept a certain level of scrutiny that comes with that. And so for those out there maybe saying, oh, well, this is why we should have played Damon Wilson over Chaz Chambliss, you can believe that, and that's fine. Georgia's almost certainly a worse team this season if that had been followed through. And Chaz Chambliss gave everything he had to the University of Georgia and delivered, I think, a strong season for him. And it's on Damon Wilson to be as good and better as Chaz Chambliss and not just hand him a starting spot because he was a former highly touted recruit.
I think that's fair. I really do. All right, in the time we have left, let me do this. So we've gotten somewhat expected draft declarations. Jalen Walker, you hate to see his career come to an end, but you knew it was going to. Malachi Stark, kind of the same way. Give me an idea of sort of what's next in that arena. Let's just do draft declaration stuff right now with, big choices still to come. Obviously, yesterday we got some great news with I took it as great news with Christian Miller coming back. So give me a little bit of a what's next as it relates to the draft declaration part of this, because that's the thing that could extend beyond the transfer portal and will extend beyond the transfer portal.
Yeah, the NFL draft window closes on January 15th. The deadline for players to enter the transfer portal from Georgia is actually the end of today. So we should have maybe some more clarity in terms of the transfer portal rather than the NFL draft. I think so far there have been no surprises when it comes to the NFL draft stuff. All the guys that have declared thus far, with maybe the exception of Arian Smith, who's probably going to be a later round pick, but he's been in school for 5 years. All those guys I think are going to be top 100 selections in this upcoming NFL draft. So it's these next wave of guys I think that have a real chance to shape how this Georgia season goes. Trevor Etienne is the biggest one that we're following right now. No decision yet. I hear that may be coming down the pipe later today. There obviously had really impressive moments this season as well, and his overall production was dimmed a little bit because of the rib injury that he had been dealing with during the later stages of the season there. Oscar Delp is another big name I think to follow there as well. Something sort of clicked and the light came on for him, I think, during the final stretch of the season, and I think he is a guy, given the connection he has with Gunnar Stockton, I think him coming back next year would be really important for this team, in addition to what he brings it from a leadership standpoint. On the defensive side of the ball, Dalen Everett is a guy I'm very, very interested in seeing what he ends up doing. I don't know if there's a player out there that made bigger strides over the final 6-7 games of the season than Dalen Everett. Obviously, defensive MVP in that SEC championship win, made big plays for this team, and I thought got a lot better over the stretch. We know he's going to test very well if he were to go to the NFL Combine, and the question is, does he see himself potentially playing his way into being a first-round corner, which I believe he has the potential to do so, or does he want to go ahead and get into the NFL and be a mid-round guy and go that route? And I think because of the cornerback situation beyond Dalen Everett, where you have Daniel Harris, you have Ellis Robinson, you have DeMello Jones, you wonder what might be the situation there. I think this cornerback position and what Dalen Everett elects to do has a number of dominoes that are going to be very interesting for this Georgia team going into the 2025 season.
And then same thing on the portal real quick. We talked about Jaden Harris. That's a guy I saw in high school. I really like him. Played for Robert Edwards at Riverwood. That's a guy I think is pretty cool. You got the Noah Thomas rumors that are out there, the wide receiver from Texas A&M. Between now and I guess the end of the day, you got at least more potential from Georgia. Give me just sort of a little bit of a thumbnail on kind of the transfer portal part of this here, too, as Georgia has the potential of still adding more guys, even though I guess class begins. So I guess you're kind of running thin on that a little bit, although I will admit not to know that fully. But certainly the deadline for Georgia guys to declare here. So give me a little bit of a thumbnail on kind of the portal part of this, too, before we let you go.
Yeah, if there's a position where you might see some guys enter the transfer portal, it's maybe the offensive line, just because they naturally carry more guys there. And there may be one or two more big surprises, but I don't think we're going to see the same mass portal exodus that maybe we've perhaps seen in years past. One interesting note here so far, and I'll knock on wood for it. Georgia has not lost any freshmen from their 2024 recruiting class to the transfer portal. I find that to be very interesting because we talked earlier about that 2023 recruiting class and the turnover you've seen there. If you're able to keep that class together, I think that's an encouraging step forward for this Georgia program, at least in terms of identifying guys that want to be here for the long haul and develop in the way that they previously had desired that to be the case. You mentioned Jaden Harris. They land him. They add him to the Branch brothers. I think safety and wide receiver are the two positions where you're going to see Georgia add. Sure, you'd love to see them add at outside linebacker, especially now with Damon Wilson moving on. But players of the caliber like that aren't just usually available in the transfer portal, which is why Damon Wilson going in is such a big news. And so I think if they're able to potentially land Noah Thomas, you land two receivers, you land two safeties, I think that's a good enough haul for what Georgia is going to bring in from the transfer portal. And then maybe you can fill out the roster the rest of the way, relying on some of the freshmen. Because I think one thing is clear with the roster turnover we've seen this season and what we even saw during the course of the 2024 season with Georgia, Kirby Smart's going to have to rely a lot more on freshmen moving forward. And I know that's a scary proposition, but when you recruit as well as Georgia has, I think you have to learn to be okay with that and understand that that's just what's going to happen.
And if you don't, by the way, they're going to use it against you. Once again, I'm making a big leap here with an educated guess that Georgia's losing Wilson in part because of negative recruiting. The negative recruiting is just out there. And if you bring in Talon Taylor and C.J. Wiley and a lot of these guys like this, and if you don't find a way to use someone, now you're not going to use all of them. They're not all going to turn out to be, I'm talking about across the board, all positions. They're not all going to turn out to be what you want. But if you bring in these guys and they're standing there watching somebody else play the entire season, you better believe that, these, rivals around us. Let me find a way to say that. These rivals around us are going to find a way to use that against Georgia. Some of these freshmen you've got to play to keep from those rival coaches talking bad about you.
And I know that Kirby Smart is sensitive and aware of this because earlier this season, he was talking about in a press conference when they had, he was talking about the lack of playing time that freshmen had gotten because they had played in so many close games this year. They weren't able to get some of their young players snaps, and he estimated they are losing about 100 snaps to where they normally are. And then when Georgia sends out the video of that press conference, that clip of Kirby talking about the snaps lost for freshmen is mysteriously edited out of that video. And so I think it's very interesting moving forward how much Georgia tries to play their freshmen and what the Bulldogs look to get out of this freshman class.
Inside baseball, nothing goes unmissed. Or guess nothing goes missed, I should say. Connor, good stuff. We'll be following everything from you. Obviously, there's more to come. Great job on the news cycle thus far. Thanks for being out there for us, and we look forward to talking to you soon here on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
Yep, as always, was a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, I just think it's a real thing. Is like some of these guys you're bringing, you really do need to see what they can do because you want to put yourself out there as the kind of team where freshmen, can play. By the way, it's not unique to Georgia. Nick Saban talked about that a lot at Alabama too, especially in the late stages of his time there. I know Mike Norvell kind of got beaten up for this at Florida State. I mean, a lot of programs have kind of gotten beaten up for, are you really playing freshmen? Are you really giving these guys a chance to play? And look, look at the 4 teams playing in the semifinals. Look how few freshmen are really making major contributions for those teams. Everybody has a hard time getting freshmen on the field because older players are, just for the most part, broadly speaking, older players are better. But every single, incoming freshman is always going to have so-and-so in their ear, agent, cousin, high school coach, whatever else, about, don't go to so-and-so school because they're not going to play because they don't play freshmen. A lot of programs deal with that, and if you can find a way, especially in this day and age in which your roster strength and your roster depth and your overall experience is not going to be what it once was, the program that kind of find a way to get the most of its freshman class and carefully selecting the sort of freshmen who have a better chance of playing for you right away, those are the kinds of programs that may have the opportunity to have more success, because I really do believe that it's going to be about maximizing the small number of truly great players in your roster and getting creative around those guys. I really do. That's what NFL teams have done for a long time. It's the first-round pick who's the kind of the bonus baby, and he makes a lot of money. It's the veteran, sometimes the veteran quarterback that makes $8 gazillion. But somewhere on that roster somewhere is the non-drafted free agent. It's the guy who, kind of impressed during training camp and found his way onto the team. Every team that massages the salary cap well in the NFL has a few of those unheralded guys who become good players. And there's got to be more of that at a place like Georgia if you want to kind of handle the NIL world which we currently live in. Now, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And then after that, I want to talk about another transfer portal as it relates to Georgia within the SEC here. Obviously, we're getting so close to our DawgNation cruise. Man, I am so excited about that. Utopia of the Seas. And I tell you, one of the things that is so great about a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation is the way in which they're always kind of pushing the envelope about the entertainment options and the cool things you get a chance to enjoy, including the ice skating rink. You have a chance to go skating on a ship. You can also see a wonderful, really like Olympic-style performers, kind of in their choreographed ice skating show. I'll tell you, when I take my kids on Royal Caribbean cruise vacations, this ends up being one of their favorite things to do. So you've got the ice skating shows, you've got the aqua theater, like the high diving. It's literally almost like being in Las Vegas or something like that, where you've got so many entertainment options at night. You have a great dinner, maybe you have a couple of cocktails after that, and then you just go see a show. And honestly, that's the kind of thing I would say that in my normal life, I don't always get to do a lot of because I'm pretty busy. But if you want, with kids and everything else, but if you want to kind of have that kind of experience while on board a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation, there is literally almost an endless opportunity for you to do that. So Jessica Slater can tell you all about it, including our DawgNation cruise coming up in April. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, Jay Slater, dreamvacations.com. Whether it's Icon of the Seas, Utopia of the Seas, the all-new Star of the Seas coming later on in the summer, Jessica Slater can tell you about all of that. Okay, let's talk about a transfer rumor for Georgia right now. Zachariah Branch, the wide receiver, along with his brother Zion. But Zachariah, the wide receiver, was big news earlier this week. But there are indications that perhaps Georgia's not done when it comes to transfer wide receivers. Noah Thomas from Texas A&M is also out there right now, too. And once again, to use some educated guessing here for a moment, the connection here would seem to be that James Coley spent some time at Texas A&M. That's where Thomas has been. Coley and Thomas seem to have a little bit of a relationship. At least you would presume they do. And that may be the entry point here for a guy in Coley who has done a really good job stocking this roster with talent for 2025. Best high school class they probably ever brought in. We'll see what the production looks like. But on paper, you love the high school receivers that Georgia's bringing in. Zachariah Branch, I think, is a pretty good transfer portal addition. He's certainly an electrifying athlete. And in the case of Noah Thomas, probably right now a more accomplished player than Branch is because he's got better stats overall. And we'll see if Thomas actually ends up coming to Georgia. There's some online chatter that suggests that he might. But let me kind of use this as a way to also kind of talk about what I really value when it comes to transfer receivers and an interesting way I think that fits into the Georgia offense overall. One of the things I really look at closely is I like guys who catch touchdowns. You know, you can have receiving yards, you can have this, you can have that, but I'm really interested in guys that catch touchdowns. Last year for Texas A&M, Noah Thomas had 8 touchdowns. And I think that's a pretty valuable thing for Georgia. Obviously, right now, you may say, well, Georgia needs all the help offensively it can get, and that's to a degree perhaps true, given the drops and things like that. But let's not just look at that. Let's go back and look at the last couple of years for Georgia in 2022 and 2023. In years in which the offense for Georgia was statistically stellar, in years like that, Georgia in 2023 was 5th nationally in points per game. The year before that, in 2022, a national championship season, they were 4th nationally in points per game. So you talk about only being a year removed from sort of consecutive seasons of being, and 2021 was pretty close too, among the highest scoring teams in all of college football. But in both those years, with Carson Beck at quarterback in 2023, with Stetson Bennett, a Heisman finalist and quarterback in 2022, despite the fact that Georgia was among the highest scoring teams in college football, Georgia wasn't quite near the top when it comes to touchdown passes thrown. In 2023 with Carson Beck, they were just 18th nationally in touchdown throws. And in Stetson's final year in 2022, they were just 17th nationally in touchdowns thrown. And what's funny is some of that even kind of predates like Bennett or Beck, even kind of going back to the time of like JT Daniels. I remember saying this about Daniels when he kind of burst on the scene in 2020. We thought he was going to be the starting quarterback for 2021. You sort of looked at all the big numbers, yards per attempt, yards per game, completion percentage. It sort of all looked like the profile potentially of an elite quarterback. But the one thing we said, we did shows about this at the time, one thing we said was probably need to see JT Daniels throw more touchdown passes. And what's funny, what we said about Daniels after the 2020 season, we had reason to sometimes say about Stetson Bennett and reason to sometimes say about Carson Beck, despite the fact in the case of Bennett and Beck, they were both playing in elite offenses. And in 2023, total confession and full clarity, Georgia did lead the nation in rushing touchdowns that year. So some would-be passing touchdowns just got turned into rushing touchdowns. But if you want to kind of think about what Georgia could do to kind of unlock its offensive potential a little more in the way of like touchdowns through the air. Like think about an Alabama SEC championship in 2023 when points became hard to come by because the Alabama defensive line was playing so well. A little more potency through the air with passing touchdowns might would have made a difference there in that spot. And so when you bring in a guy who has a penchant for catching touchdowns, and to a degree, Colby Young was going to kind of be like this too. He had pretty good touchdown numbers at Miami in 2023 before coming to Georgia this year. When you bring in a guy that's kind of had a history of catching touchdowns, I do think it gives you the potential of unlocking something in your offense that in the case of Georgia, they haven't always had. So if you could get Thomas, I think that'd be a pretty big get and probably the biggest transfer add overall for Georgia here in this cycle. So we'll watch and see if that happens for the former Aggie here. There is some chatter about that. Let me also briefly mention this for a moment. So last night I watched the FCS championship. North Dakota State won again, beat Montana State. And I got to tell you, this looked like a pretty big-time sporting event. It was in Frisco, Texas. It was on Monday night. Honestly, my memory fails me. Is this a new thing? Has it always been on this sort of Monday night spot like this? Because, my son and I, we were pretty into this game last night. It seemed like the fans were really into it. I love FCS right now because, like, the Dakota schools, North Dakota State, South Dakota State, the two Montana schools, Montana State, these kind of, like, cool states have pretty good FCS teams. It's kind of fun. I think that brand of the sport's pretty good. I really enjoyed this last night. And, like, not to be too fatalistic here for a moment about the current state of our brand of college football, but I was thinking, and pardon me for the digression, but I was thinking a little bit. Like, at times, and eventually, ultimately, I think that college football is mostly going to figure out this stuff that it's dealing with. Transfer chaos, NIL chaos. Eventually, somebody, I think, is going to help college football figure all this out. I do. I'm pretty optimistic about the future, I guess. But I was thinking, watching the FCS game last night, if this is what college football became, I mean, our college football, fewer NFL-type guys because they're going somewhere else and playing in a different league, or if finally the professionalization just takes over and this is what's left of kind of old-school college football, if it looks like North Dakota State against Montana State, I'd still watch that. I would. I mean, to me, I probably watched more North Dakota State, Montana State last night on a Monday night than any of the Monday night NFL games we saw all year long. And I don't know why I'm like that way. I just am wired that way. I just like college football better. And even with, not a ton of like NFL talent on the field last night, Trey Lance's brother plays for North Dakota State. He's a wide receiver. I guess he'll probably go to the NFL. But other than that, not really sure how many NFL players we even watched last night. But I was still really entertained by the game. And if this is where college football goes, a sport that just has a little less in the way of like NFL talent, but a lot more of kind of the cool vibe that college football's always had, I'm okay with that. I don't think we'll ever get to that point. I think our brand of college football is going to figure its stuff out. But if that's where it all goes, I think I'd probably still be okay with that and I would still tune in, because last night I had a pretty good time watching Montana State and North Dakota State. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. I want to talk some basketball here in a moment. Let me also squeeze in a mention for our friends at the Finnish Long Drink. Obviously, a lot of folks getting ready for a new year here. And, of course, you got new year and new things going on as you're getting together with friends and neighbors and anything else you got in your life. The Finnish Long Drink is going to go great for you on all of that. Obviously, cold right now. A lot of folks looking forward to getting back to golf and stuff like that. When you're at a golf course, at DawgNation, we know this firsthand. You can enjoy everything the Finnish Long Drink's all about, whether it be the peach-flavored version, the peach state, or my personal favorite, the traditional citrus. That's the blue can, the grapefruit flavor, the gin kick. There is a Finnish Long Drink variety out there for you. Many of you already know this, but if you haven't tried it yet, it's a great time to do so. Find them online, thelongdrink.com. You can put in your zip code. You can find out where you can pick some up. You can also just sort of hear the story about kind of how it came from Finland back in the summer games in the 1950s in Helsinki, and kind of how it's been in America, now Georgia, and pretty much wherever you are, the Finnish Long Drink is there too. So find them online, thelongdrink.com, for a lot more on that. Okay, before we wrap up today, let me also give a shout out to Georgia basketball. So tonight, hosting Kentucky. Kentucky, they're number 5 in the country, something like that. But Georgia, according to FanDuel, is only a 1.5-point underdog here in this spot. So Georgia has a chance to maybe pull this upset. And it would be a big one for Georgia if they could. They kind of did not have the best showing on the road at Ole Miss on Saturday. Playing big at home would obviously be a big deal here, but it's also no easy feat for a Kentucky team that scored 106 points in its last game. How about a huge contrast? Kentucky scored 106, beating Florida 106-100 on Saturday. Georgia scored just 51, losing by 12 on the road at Ole Miss. So pretty big contrast in kind of offensive productions in their most recent game. But, I know there are some tickets still available. My guess is Stegeman Coliseum is going to be rocking tonight. Perhaps with it being a midweek game, you get fewer of the Kentucky fans in the building. Maybe that's the case. Obviously, a lot of times there's a lot of Kentucky fans there in a spot like this. I don't know that Georgia will win. It's not necessarily my prediction they would. But this is a game that Georgia could win. So, and if they do, you talk about changing the whole conversation about Georgia as they kind of move into SEC play. That would be an example of that. So keep your eye on Georgia basketball tonight against Kentucky. we will certainly wish them well. And to wrap up here today with a golden shoe, one of the things with my job I'm not always great with is I'm not a personal promoter very much. Goodness knows some people are, but I am not as much into that. I probably should be. It's my job. But I'm always so grateful when some of you do that for me because I just am not always good about doing that for myself. So our buddy Stephen Wainwright for years has done that, putting it on the X platform yesterday. He says, another great show from DawgNation Daily, the place to stay up to date on all your UGA news. Stephen, I tell you, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate that. Your willingness to promote the show. For those of you who watch on YouTube, your willingness to click the like button, Facebook, the share button, word of mouth. Just for people who do that for us, you'll never know how much I appreciate that. So on behalf of all of you who do, I want to give Stephen Wainwright a golden shoe here today. Stephen, I certainly appreciate you. Thank you very much. Lousy, stinking Gators, I don't appreciate anything about y'all. In fact, I love nothing more than reminding you it's been 1,522 days since Florida's beaten Georgia. That is our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that is promised. So we will take care of some of your comments here right now. Yesterday, we went extraordinarily long. Today, we will not do quite as much, but we'll have some fun here nonetheless.
All right. BA, a couple notes.
Please, Cody
right,
Chapin
so
joins us.
FCS Championship last 2 years was played on a Sunday, so
Okay.
you're all right. It did move. And then an interesting thing I also saw, the next 2 years, it moves to Vanderbilt's campus.
That'd be fun.
Instead of Frisco, Texas.
Did you? I know you were working last night. Did you by any chance watch any of the game?
I did not.
I tell you, I thought it was pretty good football. And I think I like FCS. And I think that, look, there were a few years ago. Do you remember when, the one-and-done guys were not playing in college basketball because they were allowed to go straight to the NBA? We didn't have as much, NBA talent in college basketball. I still watch that. I mean, for whatever reason, the college brand of the sport doesn't require NFL or, in the case of basketball, NBA-level talent for me to sometimes still be entertained by it. I think the FCS brand of football is still pretty good.
And especially when stuff's on the line. Like you get to the NCAA tournament, you get those games that matter. You get to this FCS championship. When these games matter and something's on the line, it's always something special.
I'll also say this. I also like the fact that the Dakotas and Montana.
Right.
I like the fact that they're the states that are really good at FCS football. I think that makes it a little bit cooler to me too.
Yeah, if it was say Georgia State was still playing FCS.
Yeah.
If it was like a Georgia State, it doesn't mean, but it means so much to those folks. It's kind of like high school football when you get outside the metro area. And it means so much to those small communities around the state. It's the same kind of thing.
I think it's a perfect analogy, Cody. I think you're exactly right. I appreciate that. So, yeah, next couple of years in Vanderbilt and a little bit of a new thing being on Monday night. To me, that really worked for me, for sure. For sure. All right, let us see what else. Miriam Corbin mentioning snow. It seems like – so we've been talking about snow in this spot for a couple of weeks. Now, total honesty, when we first started hearing about that, my first thought was, well, I ain't got to worry about the snow because I'm going to be in Miami where it's going to be warm and sunny. Well, guess what? All of a sudden now, plans change. Now I'm going to be right here in the middle of all of it. But it certainly seems like there is a strong possibility we could be dealing with snow. Yes, it seems like that is a possibility. And perhaps even more than a possibility. Our buddy Matt Rukavina, always glad to have him here. Appreciate that. Kent Holcomb says, sure glad we all got along today. Were they fighting on Facebook yesterday? Kent, I'm sorry to hear that. William Smith says, I watched the FCS football when they reached their playoffs. Yeah, it's a good playoff. It is. It is. It's a good playoff. And look, there could come a time where, if there's too much professionalization of the very best players in college football, and listen, I hope it never gets to this, and I'm assuming it probably wouldn't, but there could come a time in which you might have to call the bluff on some of this and say, hey, if you think you're really worth millions, then let the NFL pay you. It's like we always see college. I don't want to get on a soapbox today. I really don't. But we always see college football losing in court, or the NCAA on behalf of college football losing in court. But maybe it's time to sort of challenge the NFL's rule on 3-year eligibility. I mean, there are plenty of NLRB types that think that's probably not fair. Maybe they should be sued again, as opposed to college ball always getting sued. But I'm not going to get on soapbox today. Matt says he was part of the ruckus yesterday. Plenty of people know how obsolete their position was. So there you go. So Matt in here stirring up trouble. But we love Matt nonetheless. Good to see James Crump in here, too. James is one of our longtime commenters. Troutman on the subject of Mike Bobo. I've told y'all before, y'all are free to say whatever you want. I'm not going to stand in the way of anybody's criticism. And if you want to point to valid criticism of the Georgia offense, there's plenty of that. This Georgia offense this year was I think a major step back from what it had been the previous year, and a step back from where it had been during the 2 championship seasons. That's factual. And some level of accountability for why that is appropriate. I'm not afraid of that conversation. I'm really, really not. I'm really, really not. I'm not going to necessarily just automatically agree with everybody on every kind of conclusion as it relates to that. But at the same time, there are plenty of good Georgia fans who are fed up to hear with this coach or that coach, whatever else. And I mean, I'm not gonna slow that conversation down. I promise you. And look, on the show itself, I sort of think of from when the show closed, fight song ends to from sort of fight song to fight song. That's what I think of as DawgNation Daily. This is just friends talking. But from on the actual DawgNation Daily, we're going to talk about some of this kind of stuff. We don't have time to right now because there's 1,000 pieces of news coming out. But we're not going to shy away from all that kind of stuff. As I've kind of hinted at, my personal opinion is you give this Georgia offense a Zachariah Branch and a Noah Thomas to go along with a Talon Taylor, to go along with a C.J. Wiley, to go along with all of that. I think you may Oscar Dell perhaps coming back. I think you may find this Georgia offense is pretty good next season. Perhaps it is. And you might find that, hey, maybe Mike Bobo, who statistically speaking had one of the best offenses in America in 2023, maybe he's not quite so bad. I think you could probably find that. And if you want to know the truth, if we're going to have a really blunt conversation about a Georgia assistant coach, Bobo would not be my first choice. I think there's another Georgia assistant coach that's probably in the spotlight a little bit more than that, at least with me. But I'm not going to fault people for saying what they say. I'm also not going to just sort of, knee-jerk agree with it all necessarily either. But I'm not afraid of y'all doing that. Kevin Allen says, bring back Buster Faulkner. Hey, there's also no dispute for me that Buster Faulkner's a brilliant coach. He really seems like a brilliant coach. Really does. I would also assume that Buster, sooner rather than later, is going to be a head coach. So, the idea that that's a, kind of a long-term solution, perhaps not.
Brandon, we talked so much about what you watched last night.
Sure.
The question, did you miss this? There was a theft that happened. Somebody stole your thing. Did you see this on Raw?
Oh, my gosh. First of all, I have not watched the new Raw on Netflix, but I heard it was really good. I'm actually looking forward to hopefully watching that today. Somebody took our Gator hater gimmick on Raw for a sign. That's very disappointing. Very disappointing. I mean, obviously, we don't mind Ohio State getting beaten up over this, but a little bit disappointing to see our gimmick being infringed upon there. Before you know it, people are going to be holding up Eddie the Blind Squirrel signs and things like that. That's pretty disappointing.
We got our Eddie countdown. We got to get that going again.
Yeah, we're getting very close to Eddie's return. Everybody's kind of wondering what's the story with Eddie. We're going to find out in a few days. That's pretty good, Cody. I like that.
Good stuff.
Yeah, good stuff. People were talking about the assistant coaches I'm talking about. Yeah, I mean, to me, the biggest issue right now is, and the most obvious, I would say, deficient performance. Because, I don't know that you can blame a coach for quarterback drops, even the wide receivers coach. I just don't know that you can necessarily blame a coach for those drops. But I do think the Georgia's offensive line should perform better this year. I do. And I'm not smart enough to know why that it didn't. I don't pretend to know more than I do, but I am, this is results business. The Georgia offensive line is not good. So one way or another, there's got to be a huge plan for how that gets better next season. And once again, I'm not smart enough to tell you how to do it. Could not go out there and coach myself. Would not know how to. Would not. But that group is not good enough. Not good enough. Winfred Steinspring, I'm going to go to YouTube and DawgNation.com after this, he says, we need a quarterback. I'm not on Gunner as the next coming of the next coming of the Savior. So I think the point we tried to make about Gunner going into the game against Notre Dame is that some of the myth-making out there about Gunner Stockton was unfair to Gunner. You had people trying to be like, oh, he's the next Stetson Bennett, and he's this, intangible, sort of like magical figure who was going to, like the team's going to just play harder for him. Like all of that was just so overstated and really kind of unfair to Gunner because I do think it sets up really unfair expectations. But given how Gunner played in the game, I thought he got the job done. And not a great day for the Georgia offense, but how much of that you sort of trace back to Gunner, to me, it looked like Gunner, for the most part, kind of handled his business. He did not run very much, and, I think that's a little bit different than we would have expected. But the throws that he made, I thought were, really pretty good throws. And like the moment against Texas where he got really kind of hurried, maybe the play came in late and they got the snap off late and he kind of made the really, really bad interception. I mean, I didn't see any kind of deer in the headlights moment like that against Notre Dame in the Sugar Bowl. Gunner seemed pretty comfortable. So I think you go into next season with the thought that Gunner Stockton has a chance to be a solid quarterback for you. And you may say, well, I don't want a solid quarterback. I want, I want the best quarterback in the sport. I want Joe Burrow. I want, something like that. But my response to that would be, it's like, look around. Like, who is that guy? Cam Ward was really good for Miami this year, but Miami didn't sniff the playoffs. Will Howard is playing well for Ohio State right now, but for the most part this year, Will Howard did not have a very good season. Like guys like Jackson Dart and Jalen Milroe had their moments, but they actually lost more games than Georgia did, at least during the regular season. So I think a lot of people want there to be a quarterback in college football that probably doesn't currently exist. Even with like a Cam Ward or someone like that, is there anybody out there who says that this crop of current college quarterbacks is as good as like the last few years perhaps have been? I don't know that I would think that there are. And looking forward to next year, like maybe it's Arch Manning, but that's also a guy that's not really played very much football. Maybe it's Nico Iamaleava, but y'all, like for all the attention like Nico has gotten, he didn't have a very good year for Tennessee here this year. Maybe DJ Lagway's that guy, but same type of deal. It's like, maybe it's not. It's easy to sort of, think a guy's great in small bursts. I think that Georgia's probably in pretty good hands at the quarterback spot with Gunner Stockton next year. I think as a good, capable quarterback, but this stuff leading into the Sugar Bowl of how like magical he's going to be and how the entire team's going to raise its level because of him, all of that was always unfair from the start. And if you'll notice, we were very careful not to buy into that too much with our own personal commentary. Frank Patterson says they said that Notre Dame offered Quinn Ewers $7 million. I also heard like Michigan State being a big factor in all of that. Like Magic Johnson, I guess, wants to be a major NIL player for Michigan State now. And I say this with all due respect. If that's the kind of money being thrown around to Quinn Ewers, like I'll be honest with you. If I had my choice of Quinn Ewers or Gunner Stockton, it's not obvious to me that I'd want Quinn Ewers. I just don't think he's a special player. And, he may prove to be better than Gunner. Maybe he will. Or, maybe a full year's worth of Gunner will lead us to believe that's true. But, are you impressed with Quinn Ewers? Frankly, I think a lot of us are thankful that they didn't play Arch more, against Georgia, just because I just don't think Quinn Ewers is striking fear in the heart of anybody. But allegedly, he's getting these like multi-million-dollar offers. It's crazy. Let's see what else. Texas Dog says, I want to know what happens if Ewers decides to stay at Texas. So my assumption is they gave Ewers, and I guess we got to remember they're still playing. They are giving Ewers his shot right now. My assumption is that Quinn Ewers is not going to be welcome back in Texas next year. If I had to guess, that Ewers is not welcome back. And that'll never be said publicly, but privately just sort of have to assume that next year it's Arch Manning's turn to sort of see what he can do. So Ewers can go to the NFL or he can go play somewhere else. But the opportunity to stay at Texas, my guess is that's just not really there for him. And it would not surprise me at all, once again, this is an educated guess, would not surprise me at all if these big rumors of gigantic NIL payments, if the source of those reports is not coming from the Ewers camp, if I had to guess. That's what I would maybe say. Chef Jay Bowen says, give Gunner more first-team reps and he'll get much better. Yeah, let's look. It's our first time to do this here. Let's look at the 2025 Georgia schedule for a moment. It's our first time doing this. You know we've reached the sort of early preseason. We're looking at the schedule. So it's interesting for Georgia. They go to Tennessee on September 13th. But prior to that, you got Marshall and Austin Peay. Both those are home games. Those are two really important games for Gunner Stockton. Now, pressure spot. We already got this ready to go. Look at us here on this. This is like a real show. So that Marshall game, that Austin Peay game are going to be really important games for Gunner Stockton. Now, it's going to be loud at Tennessee. That's going to be a hungry fan base for that game. But Gunner's already started a game in the playoffs. So, the idea that he's going to wilt in that moment, you wouldn't necessarily expect that to be the case. But you do want him playing his best by that time because, I would assume that Tennessee is going to be pretty good next year. So Marshall and Austin Peay, you don't have the big non-conference game against Clemson or anything like that. But two weeks to really get Gunner ready and sort of really find out what the weaponry looks like around him, that's going to be really important. And then how about this? You get a week off in between, but it's like at Tennessee, Alabama, schedule does you no favors next year compared to what it was this year. So interesting look there. But you got a couple of weeks to kind of get him ready. Maybe that's what Georgia will be able to do. Let's get some DawgNation.com commenters. Rambo says that Arch has yet to overwhelmingly impress me. Probably for all of us, that's true. But he also hasn't played very much. And maybe that's because Sarkisian knows that he's not ready. Maybe that's the case. I think you also want to, treat Ewers with some respect because future quarterbacks are also paying attention to that too. That if you're too erratic, you remember how Steve Spurrier used to pull quarterbacks in and out. It was kind of toss them around like Kleenex. You don't really see coaches do that very much anymore. So, it's hard to read between the lines about exactly what's been going on with Ewers, but I have been steadfast in my belief that Ewers would not be able to win them a national championship. Now, we'll find out soon if that's right or wrong, but that's what I've been kind of saying. Let's see what else is going on here. Yard Dog asking about how all this impacts the sort of class registration part of this. Yeah, I think in some cases, if guys know where they're going, they may kind of get the sort of back channel student registration going. Some of there's also I'm speaking well beyond my knowledge here, but there's also drop ad. So while you have class at the beginning, you do have drop ad that continues for a little while here. But, the transfer portal is the one place where academics still really matters because you do have to get accepted into the school that you're going to, at least for now, until somebody sues. And then after that, that's going to probably change too. And the guys they won't even be students anymore at that point. But we do know of examples of so-and-so, how come he didn't transfer in whatever year? Oftentimes, academics ends up being the reason why that for transfer quarterback who could maybe change the fortunes for a team or something like that. Sometimes when guys stay put, sometimes the academic part of it ends up being a reason why. Yard Dog says if Ewers wins the national title and then transfers, it'd be the ultimate statement of how bad college football's become. I guess so. I see what you're saying. It would certainly be a weird deal, but it's also an example of, are you going to really bring in Arch Manning and just never use him? I mean, eventually, I do think you want to know what you have in Arch Manning. And it's actually an interesting question. Would Texas fans rather have Quinn Ewers coming off a national championship or Arch Manning? That's actually an interesting question. My guess is Texas fans would probably still rather have Arch Manning, but maybe I'm wrong. But it's an interesting point. Let's see what else. RR says, let's not forget with Bobo, we're going to lose 3 games. So, I mean, look, here's the deal. I mean, I told you before, y'all can say whatever you want to, but you got to be really careful about always and never opinions. Georgia always does this. This guy always does that. This guy will never do this. Because, y'all, I've been sitting in this chair now for going on 10 years. A lot of this is never going to happen style opinions have been proven wrong over and over again. Not always, but oftentimes they do. So if you want to evaluate what Georgia was, I would say you have all kinds of evidence to perhaps support your point. But if you want to tell me what's never going to happen and what always happens, you know, some of that kind of stuff is sort of true sometimes until it's not. And I just find anytime somebody tries to guarantee me something about the future, I find those opinions to be really uninteresting. Because as somebody who's kind of in the predictions business, predictions are really hard. So if you want to kind of make an assessment of what was, you got plenty of evidence. If you want to guarantee me what the future is going to look like, you know, you're going to have to count me as skeptical in some of that. Yeah, KC mentioned the school accepting academically. It has to happen. Now, for the most part, most players are in good standing. I would say it's pretty rare to not get accepted, but you do have to get accepted. It's one of the reasons why some of these, you know, fancy pants schools don't play the transfer part of this too well, especially like the grad transfer thing where I want to say, I forget if it's Vanderbilt or Stanford, but there was a story, and there has been stories before about how, like, you know, I'm going to get some of the facts wrong, but let's say it's a player graduated and needed to go to graduate school and did not get accepted, so therefore had to go play somewhere else. Like, I have, like, the details on that perhaps wrong, but there are situations. I can't remember if it's like a Stanford or Vanderbilt. Maybe it's both. But some of these, like, really, like, elite academic universities, they make more money, far more money off the school itself than they do athletics. Like, we think of college athletics as being big business, but college athletics is dwarfed by the actual business of college itself. College is gigantic business. It's one of the reasons why I believe, once again, not to get on a soapbox here, but when it comes to, like, well, how do you pay for, like, the non-revenue sports? I'm a big believer the colleges themselves should have to pay for that because they're getting marketing benefit from that. They don't make enough money to support themselves. It's unfair to ask all the football teams to support all that. That's a huge issue as it relates right now where football players are out there risking their lives, risking very serious injury so the, you know, whatever team can travel across the country and pretend to be a big-time sport when they could never afford to do this based on their own revenue. It's completely unfair. The fact that no one gives voice to how unfair that is, I mean, it's so annoying to me. But if you want to have, you know, 14, 20, however many there is, you know, varsity level sports, you know, competitive level sports, I think the college themselves ought to have to pay for some of that. But that's a soapbox for a different day. Let's see what else. Greg Rosenberg says you're either elite or you're not. Our team is very firmly in the not category now. I don't dispute that. This was not an elite season for Georgia. It was not really an elite performance. But at the same time, and we're going to do this on the show at some point down this week, just be careful about lumping yourself in with people who say it's all over for Georgia. this just sort of proves that, Georgia's no different than anybody else now. I mean, they beat Texas twice. They beat Clemson, a playoff team, by 31 points. They won this SEC, the most challenging SEC of all time, the most difficult schedule that any SEC champion has ever played. Like, just be really, really careful about kind of joining the sort of chorus of national media types who now want to treat Georgia as no different than any other team. A harsh evaluation of how the team performed in the moment is fair. It's a pretty big drop-off for Georgia to lose to a team like Notre Dame. It just is. I mean, Notre Dame did not have to do very much to beat Georgia, at least somewhat convincingly, in the Sugar Bowl. That's a big drop-off. I think it's totally fair. Just be careful about too many assumptions about kind of what that means for the team going forward. Greg Rosenberg says every beat writer walks on eggshells when it comes to critiquing coaches because they need sources in the building. Look, I've said this 1,000 times, and I'm going to always say this. When I begin every show, I say DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. That is a reminder for me as much as a statement to you. I don't do this show for anybody at Butts-Mehre Heritage Hall. I really don't. I do this show for all of you because ultimately the 10 coaches at Georgia could be happy with me. But if the many, many tens upon tens of thousands of you are not happy with me, I don't have a job, right? It's like me trying to please people in that very, very small building at the expense of, being honest with all of you. That's not a good way to maintain long-term employment. So ultimately, I exist to serve you, and I want our conversation on the show to reflect what fans are discussing. But that doesn't mean that I'm automatically going to agree with everything that everybody says. Is it fair to criticize Georgia? Yes. Is it fair to criticize some of the Georgia coaches? I believe yes. Is the situation with some of those coaches, especially as it relates to Mike Bobo, as dire as some people on here describe it to be? I don't think so. And you'll see lots of examples over the course of time where, we've just been a little slower in condemning than some other folks have been, and we've kind of turned out to be right. Now, it won't always be the case. Maybe the Georgia offense, it's entirely possible that if Bobo comes back and everything takes place, maybe the Georgia offense in 2025 is even worse than it was in 2024. Well, at that point in time, you got to change the nature of the conversation a little bit. But look, there were plenty of people, even after like a national championship season, that would have wanted to condemn Stetson Bennett and say, well, you're never going to win anything with Bennett. You got to – we just try to say things that we don't have to go back and recant later. Maybe that means we move a step slower than the prevailing wisdom of the fan base on some issues. But I can't just change my username and start, not to say, Greg, that you would. I can't just change my username if my opinions turn out to be wrong. Like, this is my name. This is my life. This is my career. This is my job. I have to be, I have to make sure that what I say I am able to stand by. And I get predictions wrong, things like that. Sometimes that happens. But we're going to be a forum for fans to talk about all that they see going on. But that doesn't mean that I'll always be in lockstep agreement with every single one of those statements. And for me, that's okay. I think a little bit of disagreement right now is sort of okay. This is just what we do. We're very passionate about Georgia football. We get in here and we talk about it and we try to figure it all out. And sometimes on a topic that people are passionate about, that passion is going to kind of bubble to the surface, and people may argue a little bit. You may get mad at me because I'm not saying something as forcefully as you'd like for me to, or something like that. I'm okay with that. People have criticized me before. But ultimately, I can promise you that this show will always serve the fans, and we want to have the conversation that fans are having, even if we don't always completely reflect the prevailing wisdom that fans are expressing, if that makes sense. Jonathan Aaron says, with all the guys we signed at receiver, plus the bringing in Zachariah Branch, maybe Noah Thomas from Texas A&M. Is this the most kind of upgraded the Georgia wide receiver room has ever been? Certainly seems like it, certainly seems like it could be. Now, admittedly, we've sort of said that before, and it hasn't always worked out. But this time, maybe it really is the case. I mean, once again, to kind of go back to the fan conversation, I mean, the one thing that I would take some comfort in if I was sort of a regular fan, in many ways, that's what I am, just a regular fan. Like Kirby Smart does not seem to be existing in some ivory tower somewhere separate from the feelings of people who have a lot of emotion invested in Georgia football. All of you say, man, this offense has got to be better. Too many wide receiver drops, not enough this, not enough that. I mean, when it comes to who they've signed out of high school and who they seem to be pursuing under the transfer portal, you can't say they're not trying. I don't mean this in the way that they get a gold star for trying, but what you would say that you see the issue as being, Georgia seems ready to kind of address some of that too. And, it certainly appears that Kirby Smart's opinion on Mike Bobo is perhaps different than some of yours is. But I got to be honest with you. I don't think some of y'all have as much evidence on your side of arguing against Bobo as some of you think you do. I don't. But maybe next year you will. But right now I don't think you necessarily do. DSA says that's what I expect you to, is not agree with everything everyone says. It wouldn't make it more interesting if you did. Yeah. I mean, look, if we're all having around like the lunch table together, this is what it's going to sound like. Well, I think this and I think that. I mean, Connor and I disagree with a couple things today. That's just what football conversations are. So, yeah. I mean, that's just kind of how it's going to go sometimes. Paul Moon also brings up a pretty good point. I said this on social media a few times. It's like Georgia in 2024 had a really bad habit of putting themselves in a really tough spot. Like they would just get themselves into a mess almost every game. But they never really quit. Even against Notre Dame, they never really quit right there. So as Paul was saying, if you can find a way to keep that part of Georgia in place for next year and kind of get rid of some of the – if you can keep some of the resiliency while also losing some of the need to show resiliency, you could be in a pretty good spot. Greg Rosenberg says a 2-loss team will win the national title this year. When was the last time that happened? So I believe the last time we had a year with no unbeaten teams, I believe that's 2003. Y'all check my math on that. LSU and USC split the title that year. There was no unbeaten team in college football. Were either one of them a 2-loss team? Probably not. But I do believe this is the first year since 2003 with no unbeaten teams. Y'all check my math on that, see if I'm right. Okay, we got to get ready to go. Let me go back to DawgNation.com for a moment. Let's see what else at DawgNation.com. A lot of some of the Bobo stuff. Garrison Tucker, Frogger 2000 on the Bobo thing. Listen, I realize he's not very popular with many of you right now. I do get that. I do get that. And if he does stay, he's going to be facing some pressure next season to be better. I think that's probably the case. But at the same time, I thought that Georgia was really good offensively in 2023. Like the one thing, and on a show at some point in time, we're going to kind of lay this out more. Like the one thing that Bobo has had issue with in comparison to Todd Monken is that Monken had big offensive performances in the biggest games that Georgia played. SEC championship playoff games, things like that. For the most part, big offensive performances. That's one area which Bobo needs to improve. But for a full season, 2023, I mean, they were fifth nationally in points per game. That's one of the reasons why Kirby Smart's probably not all that moved by the calls for Bobo's job, is we're only 1 year removed from a team that scored 40 points per game. And that was a year after 2 straight national championships. That as I said, whether you want to hear this or not, the truth is Kirby Smart has won enough right now that he doesn't have to He doesn't have to make a knee-jerk firing, especially, of someone who I think he has genuine trust for. He just doesn't have to do that right now. Garrison Tugger asking, do we see Talon Taylor get used more than Nitro Tuggle did this year? I believe probably so, yes. I believe probably so. I think it would behoove Georgia to do that, and I believe it probably will play Taylor more. And it may play a couple of those freshmen more. But in the case of Talon Taylor, you certainly hope that's the case. BTD Troutman says, when you judge Mike Bobo, you also have to look at his play calling in situations. I think that's true. And look, I'll be the first to tell you, go back to 2014, like not giving the ball to Todd Gurley to goal line against South Carolina, horrible decision. That's a bad situational play call, at least the best I can understand. I think some judgments on situational play calling, though, end up being kind of a hindsight's 2020 type deal where every play seems stupid when it doesn't work, if that makes sense. Let's see what else. And, to go back to completely relitigate the era under Mark Richt, I don't think that's close to the same thing because, go look at some of the best performances on a per game, our individual game basis for Bobo. Look how many points Georgia gave up. There are plenty of games in which they scored plenty enough to win, but maybe just gave up more points. Georgia had a lot more. I don't think that Mike Bobo is anywhere close to being the main reason that Georgia didn't win a championship under Mark Richt. I don't think it's anywhere close to being the number one reason. Not really close. But there's no doubt he's definitely not popular. There's no doubt. Brian Whitaker wants to use Lawson Lucky more. I think that's a good idea. All right, so look, we'll keep doing this, and I promise you I will be a platform for all of this discussion. I really will. We did this with Stetson a couple of years ago. We'll do this with Bobo now. We will entertain a lot of these conversations, and I'm going to try to be as fair as I can, and including even sort of citing some of the evidence about why people have justifiable reason to be disappointed with the Georgia offense this past season, and in 2024. And why I think it could still be in okay shape moving forward. We'll try to do all of that, and we'll just see where it lands here for UGA, and perhaps pay attention to all the other news that's going to get ready to come out too. So, thanks to R.S. Andrews to make the cool down possible online. rsandrews.com is a great time to get that heating system tuned back up to factory fresh specs because it's about to be very, very cold, including we're told snow on the way here. So. We'll see if that's the case. So find them online, rsandrews.com. Y'all have a great day. Back tomorrow, DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. We'll look forward to talking to you then.